The shuttle descended through the purple clouds of Station Vareth, and Daniel Cole pressed his face closer to the viewport to get a better look at the massive structure below. A spinning ring of metal and light that served as the heart of galactic diplomacy for over 10,000 years. And he could feel his stomach tighten with a mixture of excitement and dread as the docking clamps engaged with a soft thud. Commander Lavra Kent stood behind him, her military uniform pressed and perfect, her expression calm but watchful as she studied the datapad in her hands. And she cleared her throat to get his attention before speaking in a low voice. "Ambassador, I have updated intelligence on the Zirithi delegation," she said, scrolling through the information with quick fingers. "Princess Valara Sithis will be leading their negotiations, which is unusual because she has never handled anything this important before." Daniel turned away from the viewport and straightened his simple black suit, a stark contrast to the elaborate robes and armor that most alien diplomats preferred. And he nodded slowly as he processed this information. "The Emperor's daughter," he replied. "I read her file on the journey here, and everything suggests she views other species as inferior, especially younger civilizations like ours." Lavra handed him the datapad so he could see for himself, and the image showed a tall alien female with silver skin and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on her face, her expression one of absolute confidence bordering on contempt. And Daniel memorized her features before handing the device back. The airlock opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and a wave of warm air carrying strange scents washed over them as they stepped onto the station for the first time. And Daniel was immediately struck by the scale of everything around him. With corridors wide enough to accommodate species 3 times human size, and ceilings that vanished into soft blue lighting far above, small creature with too many legs scurried up to them, its translator device clicking and whirring as it spoke in a high-pitched voice. "Welcome to Station Vareth, honored representatives of Earth. I am Facilitator Grex, and I will escort you to your assigned quarters," the creature announced, already turning to lead them deeper into the station. "The Council has prepared accommodations suitable for your biological requirements." Daniel and Lara followed the facilitator through winding corridors filled with aliens of every shape and size. And Daniel noticed how many of them paused to stare at the humans passing by, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. And he kept his face neutral, even as he heard whispered comments in languages his translator struggled to process. "Short-lived primitives," one voice said clearly enough for him to understand. And another added something about aggressive biology that made Laura's jaw tighten with anger. They reached their quarters after what felt like an hour of walking, and Facilitator Grex showed them inside a suite of rooms that were comfortable but noticeably smaller than what Daniel had seen assigned to other delegations. And he thanked the creature politely before it scurried away to attend to other duties. Laura secured the door and activated the privacy screens before allowing herself to relax, and she dropped into a chair with a frustrated sigh. "They put us in the outer ring," she observed. "That means we have the longest walk to the council chamber, which is either an insult or a test to see how we react." Daniel examined the room with careful eyes, checking for surveillance devices out of habit, even though he knew the station's neutrality laws prohibited such things. And he found the space adequate if not impressive. "Probably both," he admitted. "Humanity has only been part of the galactic community for 40 years, Lavra, and we are the youngest species with a seat at the table by a margin of several thousand years. So we cannot expect to be treated as equals right away." Lavra stood and moved to the window, which offered a view of the station's central hub, where ships from 100 worlds came and went in an endless dance of commerce and diplomacy. And her reflection in the glass showed concern she would never voice aloud. "The council agenda was released while we were docking," she said without turning around. Earth's petition for expanded mining rights in the neutral territories has been placed last on the schedule, after 63 other items. Daniel felt his heart sink at this news, because being placed last was a deliberate message from the Council, a way of telling humanity that their concerns mattered less than everyone else's. And he knew that some delegations would leave before Earth even had a chance to speak. Who controls the agenda? He asked, already suspecting the answer. The Zerthi Empire has held that privilege for 800 years. Lavra confirmed. Which means Princess Valara personally decided where to place our petition. Daniel sat down on the edge of the bed and rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical force. Because he was not just representing himself, or even his government, but the entire human species. And any mistake he made would have consequences for generations to come. We have the opening ceremonies tomorrow, he said after a long moment of silence. Every delegation presents formal greetings to the Council, which gives me a chance to address the chamber directly. Lavra finally turned away from the window, and her expression had shifted from frustration to something harder and more determined. What are you planning to say? Daniel reached into his bag and pulled out a folder containing his prepared remarks. Pages of carefully crafted diplomatic language, designed to present humanity in the best possible light while requesting fair treatment from the Council. I was going to emphasize our contributions to galactic science and medicine, he explained. Remind them that human researchers developed the treatment for Valorian plague and that our engineers helped repair the communication relay network after the drift storm of Cycle 4847. Laura nodded slowly, recognizing the approach as solid if conventional. But something in her eyes suggested she expected their hosts to make things difficult. Regardless of what Daniel said, get some rest. Ambassador, she advised, moving toward the door that connected their quarters. Tomorrow will be a long day, and I have a feeling the Zerathi princess will not make it easy for us. Daniel watched her leave before turning back to his remarks, reading through them one more time with growing uncertainty, because everything he had written assumed the Council would give him a fair hearing, and he was beginning to realize that assumption might be dangerously wrong. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast station that represented everything humanity hoped to achieve among the stars. And he made himself a silent promise that no matter what happened tomorrow, he would represent his species with dignity. The purple clouds swirled below the station like a restless ocean. And somewhere in the central hub, Princess Valara Sithis was probably preparing her own plans for the opening ceremonies. Plans that Daniel suspected would not include treating the human delegation with respect. He did not know yet how right he would prove to be. The council chamber was the largest enclosed space Daniel had ever seen. A circular room nearly a mile across with tiered seating rising up toward a domed ceiling that displayed a live image of the galaxy spinning slowly above the assembled delegates. And he felt very small as he walked toward the human section with Laura Kent at his side. Thousands of aliens filled the chamber, representing species from every corner of known space. And the noise of their conversations created a constant hum that vibrated in Daniel's chest like distant thunder. And he kept his eyes forward as he navigated through the crowd. The human section was located near the back of the chamber, far from the central podium where speakers would address the council. And Daniel noticed that they had been placed between a delegation of insectoid creatures who clicked their mandibles nervously and a group of tall gray beings who refused to acknowledge the humans at all. Perfect seating arrangement, Laura muttered sarcastically as they took their places. We can barely see the podium from here. Daniel said nothing, but he shared her frustration as he settled into his seat and reviewed his prepared remarks one final time, hoping that his message would reach the council despite the obvious attempts to marginalize humanity's presence. Deep gong sound echoed through the chamber, silencing all conversation instantly, and High Chancellor Morven emerged from a door behind the central podium. His ancient body supported by a floating platform that carried him slowly to his position of authority. Morven was of the Shun, one of the founding species of the Council, and his pale blue skin was covered in intricate patterns that told the story of his 3,000 years of life. And when he spoke, his voice carried effortlessly to every corner of the massive chamber. "The Council is now in session," he announced in a tone that demanded respect. "We gather today to begin the cycle's negotiations on matters of trade, territory, and mutual cooperation among the civilized peoples of the galaxy." Daniel listened carefully as the Chancellor outlined the ceremonial procedures, explaining that each delegation would present formal greetings to the Council before the actual negotiations began. And he noted that the order of speakers had been arranged by the age of each civilization, meaning humanity would speak last. The first delegation to approach the podium was the Zirithi Empire, of course, because their civilization stretched back over 40,000 years, and they never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of that fact. And Daniel watched as Princess Valara Sithis glided toward the central platform with fluid grace. She was even more imposing in person than her image had suggested, standing nearly 7 feet tall with silver skin that seemed to glow under the chamber's lights. And her 4 eyes swept across the assembled delegates with obvious contempt before settling on the podium's controls. "The Zirithi Empire greets the Council," she began, her voice smooth and cold like ice sliding across metal. "We come bearing gifts of wisdom and prosperity for those species fortunate enough to earn our favor." Her speech continued for several minutes, filled with boasts about Zirathi achievements and subtle insults directed at younger civilizations. And Daniel noticed that she glanced toward the human section several times with an expression that made him uncomfortable. One by one, the other delegations presented their greetings, and Daniel watched the clock on his datapad as hours passed and his turn drew closer. And he rehearsed his remarks silently until he knew every word by heart. Finally, after 63 other species had spoken, Chancellor Morven called upon the delegation from Earth, and Daniel rose from his seat with his folder of prepared remarks clutched in his hands as he began the long walk toward the central podium. The chamber felt unusually quiet as he walked, and he could feel thousands of eyes watching his every step, judging him, measuring him against the representatives who had come before. And he climbed the steps to the podium with his head held high despite the weight of their stares. He opened his folder and was about to begin speaking when a clear voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Wait," Princess Valara commanded, and she rose from her seat in the front row with a smile that held no warmth. "Before the human speaks, I believe the Council deserves to hear some context about this species." Daniel froze with his mouth open, unsure how to respond to this breach of protocol, and he looked toward Chancellor Morven for guidance, but the ancient Deshan merely gestured for Valara to continue. "Humanity." Valara said the word like it was something unpleasant she had found on her shoe. A species so young that their entire recorded history could fit in a single chapter of Zirathi archives. A species so primitive that they were still fighting wars among themselves. When my grandmother was born, laughter rippled through the chamber, soft at first but growing louder as Valara continued her speech. "They come from a world they call Earth, a violent planet filled with predators and natural disasters. And this hostile environment has shaped them into aggressive creatures who solve their problems with violence rather than wisdom." More laughter, and Daniel felt his face growing hot with anger and shame as the princess continued to mock everything he represented. "Their lifespans are so short that by the time they learn anything useful, they die and must teach everything to their replacements all over again," Valara said with exaggerated pity. "It is amazing they accomplish space travel at all, though I suspect they simply copied technology from more advanced species. The chamber erupted in open laughter now, with delegates from dozens of species joining in the mockery. And Daniel stood at the podium unable to speak as wave after wave of humiliation washed over him. "I wonder," Valara mused aloud while tapping one long finger against her chin, "why the council even granted membership to such a primitive species. Perhaps we needed someone to clean the station's waste recyclers." This joke earned the loudest laughter yet. And Daniel saw Laura Kent in the human section, with her hands clenched so tight her knuckles had turned white. And he knew she wanted nothing more than to storm the podium and defend their species with words or fist princess. Valara finally turned to face Daniel directly, and her 4 eyes glittered with cruel amusement as she delivered her final insult. Perhaps the human should kneel and thank the council for tolerating his presence among civilized beings, she suggested in a sweet voice that dripped with venom. That would be a more appropriate greeting than whatever primitive words he has prepared. The chamber waited in eager anticipation, expecting either submission or an angry outburst that would prove everything Valara had said about human aggression. And Daniel stood at the podium with his prepared remarks still unread in his trembling hands. He looked at Princess Valara for a long moment, then at the laughing delegates, then at his own people sitting in the back of the chamber with expressions of helpless fury, and then Daniel Cole made a decision that would change galactic history forever. Daniel looked at Princess Valara with an expression that revealed nothing of the storm raging inside him. And for a moment, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited to see how the human would react to such complete and public humiliation. He did not shout or protest or demand an apology. And he did not kneel, as Valara had suggested. And he did not even finish opening his folder of prepared remarks that he had worked so hard to perfect. Instead, Daniel Cole simply closed his folder with a soft sound that somehow echoed through the massive chamber. And he placed it gently on the podium, as if he no longer needed what was written inside. And then he turned away from the microphone without saying a single word. The laughter died instantly as delegates realized what was happening. And a confused murmur spread through the crowd as Daniel walked calmly toward the steps leading down from the podium, his footsteps steady and unhurried as if he had all the time in the universe. "Where do you think you are going?" Valara demanded, her voice sharp with surprise and the first hint of uncertainty. "I have not given you permission to leave." Daniel did not pause or turn around or acknowledge her words in any way. And he descended the steps with the same measured pace, while thousands of aliens watched in stunned silence. Unable to process what they were witnessing, Laura Kent rose from her seat in the human section as Daniel approached. And without any signal or spoken command, she fell into step beside him as they walked toward the chamber's main exit. And behind them, the rest of the human delegation stood as one and followed their ambassador. The sound of human footsteps echoed through the chamber like a drumbeat, steady and purposeful and completely without haste. And no one spoke as the small group of humans made their way past row after row of alien delegates who had been laughing at them, just moments before Daniel reached the massive doors that led out of the chamber. And he paused for just a moment to look back at the podium where Princess Valara still stood with an expression of growing horror on her silver face. And then he walked through the doors and let them close behind him. The silence that followed was unlike anything the council chamber had experienced in 10,000 years of diplomatic proceedings, because no species had ever walked away from a formal session before. And the implications of what Daniel had just done began to dawn on the assembled delegates one by one. Chancellor Morven gripped the edge of his floating platform with trembling hands, and his ancient face had gone pale as he recognized the significance of the human's actions. Because under the oldest and most sacred laws of galactic diplomacy, walking away from negotiations was a declaration that the offending party was beneath acknowledgement. Princess Valara seemed frozen in place, her 4 eyes blinking rapidly as she processed what had just happened. And she turned toward her father, Emperor Sithis, who sat in the imperial box with an expression of barely contained fury directed at his own daughter. "What have you done?" The Emperor's voice cut through the silence like a whip, and Valara flinched as if she had been struck. "Do you understand what you have done?" Valara opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. And she looked around the chamber for support, only to find that the other delegates were already whispering among themselves, their earlier laughter replaced by worried discussions about what the humans' departure meant for their own interests. "Chancellor." Morven finally found his voice and attempted to restore order to the proceedings. "The council will take a brief recess," he announced in a voice that cracked with stress. "Facilitators will attempt to contact the human delegation and invite them to return." But everyone in the chamber knew that such an invitation would be refused, because Daniel Cole had invoked a tradition older than most of the species present. A tradition that stated when one party demonstrates such disrespect that productive negotiation becomes impossible. The offended party has the right to withdraw without penalty. More than that, under the ancient laws, Earth was now entitled to seek bilateral agreements with any species while formally boycotting all dealings with the Zirithi Empire, which meant humanity could build alliances and trade partnerships that excluded the most powerful civilization in the galaxy in his quarters on the outer ring of the station. Daniel stood at the window and watched ships come and go from the central hub while Lara Kent secured the door and activated every privacy measure they had available. That was either the bravest thing I have ever seen or the stupidest. Lara said after a long moment of silence. "I honestly cannot tell which." Daniel continued to watch the ships, his reflection in the glass showing a man who had aged 10 years in the last hour. And when he finally spoke, his voice was tired, but steady. "She wanted me to react," he explained. "Either to submit and prove humans are weak, or to lash out and prove humans are aggressive savages who do not belong in civilized society. So I chose a third option that she never considered." Lara moved to stand beside him, and her expression had shifted from concern to something that looked almost like admiration. "You invoked the protocol of withdrawal," she said. "I did not even know humans were allowed to use that." Given how new we are to the council, Daniel smiled without humor, a small twist of his lips that held no joy. "The protocol has no restrictions based on species age or membership duration. I checked before we left Earth because I wanted to know all of our options in case negotiations went badly." A chime sounded at their door, and Lara checked the security display to see Facilitator Grex waiting outside with several other station officials, all of them looking extremely nervous. "The council has sent representatives," Lara reported. "They probably want us to return to the chamber." Daniel turned away from the window and straightened his suit, making sure he looked calm and composed despite the exhaustion he felt deep in his bones. "Let them in," he said. "But make it clear that we have no intention of returning to any session where the Zirithi Empire is present. At least not until we receive a formal acknowledgement of the insult and appropriate remediation." Lara opened the door, and the station officials hurried inside, their translator devices clicking frantically as they all tried to speak at once, begging the human ambassador to reconsider his position and return to the council chamber where everything could be resolved. Daniel listened politely to their pleas for several minutes before raising one hand to silence them. "Please inform the council that Earth appreciates their concern," he said in a voice that was perfectly pleasant and absolutely unyielding. "However, humanity will conduct business only with species that demonstrate basic respect for our delegation. And until such respect is shown, we will exercise our rights under the protocol of withdrawal." The officials exchanged horrified glances, realizing that the human had no intention of backing down. And they hurried away to deliver this message to Chancellor Morven while Daniel returned to his position at the window. What happens now? Laura asked. Daniel watched a Zirathi warship departing the station, probably carrying news of the disaster back to the Empire's homeworld, and he allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction before answering. Now we wait, he said, and we see who comes to us. The first visitor arrived within 6 hours of Daniel's departure from the council chamber. A small delegation from the Velish Collective, whose homeworld had been fighting Zirathi economic pressure for centuries. And they came bearing gifts of rare minerals and an offer of exclusive trade rights that would have been unthinkable. Just 1 day earlier, Laura Kent escorted them into the human quarters with barely concealed surprise. And she watched as Daniel received them with the same calm dignity he had shown when walking away from Princess Valara's mockery. Ambassador Cole, the lead Velish delegate, said through her translator, a feathered crest rising and falling with obvious excitement. The collective has watched humanity from afar since your species first reached the stars. And we have always believed you deserved better treatment than the council has provided. Daniel offered them seats and refreshments, treating them with the same respect he would have shown any honored guest. And he listened carefully as they explained their proposal. The Zirathi have controlled galactic trade for too long. The delegate continued. They set prices, they dictate terms, they punish anyone who tries to deal directly with species they consider beneath them. But your action today has shown the galaxy that their power is not absolute. More delegations came as the hours passed, each one bringing offers that grew more generous as word spread about humanity's stand against Zirathi arrogance. And by the end of the first day, Daniel had received trade proposals from 12 different species, several of whom had not even acknowledged Earth's existence before today. Laura compiled the offers into a database and presented Daniel with a summary that made her eyes widen with disbelief. If we accept even half of these proposals, Earth's economy will grow by 30% within 5 years, she reported. And 3 of these species are offering military cooperation treaties that would give us access to defensive technologies far beyond anything we could develop on our own. Daniel reviewed the data carefully, aware that every decision he made in the coming days would shape humanity's future among the stars. And he selected the most promising offers for further negotiation, while politely declining those that came with unacceptable conditions. Meanwhile, in the Imperial section of Station Vareth, Emperor Sithis Kelvorn paced his luxurious quarters with fury burning in all 4 of his eyes. And Princess Valara sat in a corner chair trying to make herself as small as possible, while her father raged about the disaster she had caused. Do you have any idea what you have done? The Emperor demanded for the 100th time, his silver skin flushing dark with anger. The humans were going to be easy allies. They needed our protection and our technology and our trade networks, and they would have been grateful for whatever scraps we chose to give them. Valara flinched at each word, her earlier confidence completely shattered by the consequences of her actions. And she could not meet her father's eyes as he continued his tirade. But you could not resist showing off in front of the council, Emperor Sithis continued. You had to prove how clever and superior you are by humiliating a species that was willing to work with us. And now look what has happened. He activated a display screen that showed a map of current galactic alliances. And Valara watched in horror as indicator lights blinked to show species that had already begun negotiations with humanity, forming a web of connections that excluded Zirathi interests entirely. The Velish Collective, the Thornax Federation, the Mendari Union. The Emperor listed the names like accusations. Species we have been trying to bring under our influence for generations are now flocking to the humans because you made Earth look like victims and us look like bullies. Valara finally found her voice. Though it came out weak and defensive, they are primitives, father. Surely the council will not take their side over ours in any serious dispute. Emperor Sithis stopped pacing and turned to face his daughter with an expression of utter contempt. The council does not matter anymore, he said slowly, making sure she understood every word. By invoking the protocol of withdrawal, the human has given Earth the right to bypass council processes entirely and deal directly with any species that welcomes them. And many species welcome them now specifically because you gave them a reason to oppose us. The Emperor dismissed Valara with a wave of his hand and called for his chief advisor, an elderly Zerathi named Lord Thesson, who had served the imperial family for over 1,000 years. We need to repair this damage, the Emperor told his advisor. What options do we have? Lord Thesson considered the question carefully before responding. His aged face creased with worry. Very few, Majesty. The human acted within his rights under galactic law, and any attempt to pressure Earth directly would only confirm the narrative that we are bullies who cannot handle being challenged. The Emperor slammed his fist against the table, cracking the surface with the force of his frustration. Then find me another option. We cannot allow humanity to build an alliance network that rivals our own. Not when their medical technology and engineering expertise could tip the balance of power against us. Lord Thesson bowed low before speaking again. There may be one path forward, Majesty, but it would require something the Zerathi Empire has not offered another species in 3,000 years. The Emperor stared at his advisor with narrowed eyes. Speak plainly. What do you suggest? Lord Thesson took a deep breath before delivering his recommendation, a formal apology. Majesty, deliver publicly before the Council and the galaxy, acknowledging the insult to humanity and requesting renewed negotiations on terms of equality rather than superiority. For a long moment, Emperor Sithis said nothing, his face a mask of conflicting emotions as he weighed his pride against the political reality of the situation. And finally he nodded slowly. Arrange a meeting with the human ambassador, he commanded. I will do what must be done to protect the Empire, even if it means humbling myself before a species my daughter called primitive. Back in the human quarters, Daniel received word of the Emperor's request with a mixture of satisfaction and caution, and he discussed the development with Laura late into the station's artificial night. They are going to try to undo the damage, Laura observed. An apology from the Emperor himself would go a long way toward restoring normal relations. Daniel nodded slowly, but his expression remained thoughtful. It would, he agreed. But normal relations are not what Earth needs. We need respect. And respect does not come from apologies alone. Laura raised an eyebrow, curious about what her ambassador was planning. What are you thinking? Daniel smiled, and for the first time since arriving at Station Vareth, there was genuine warmth in his expression. I am thinking that the Zerathi princess started this mess in front of the entire council. And if there is going to be an apology, it should come from her in the same place, so that everyone who watched her mock humanity can watch her take it back. Lavra considered this for a moment before a matching smile spread across her face. That would be quite a sight, she admitted. Daniel returned his attention to the datapad, containing all the trade offers humanity had received in the past day, and he felt a sense of hope that had been absent when he first arrived at the station. Send word to Emperor Sithis, he instructed Laura. Tell him I am willing to meet, but make it clear that any resolution will require more than private words in a private room. Lavra nodded and moved to compose the message, and Daniel turned back to the window where the purple clouds of Station Vareth continued their endless swirling dance below. The galaxy was watching humanity now, truly watching for the first time, and Daniel intended to make sure they liked what they saw. One galactic standard month had passed since Daniel Cole walked out of the council chamber, and in that time, humanity had signed preliminary agreements with 17 different species, established 3 new trade routes, and received invitations to join 2 separate defensive alliances that had previously been closed to younger civilizations. The galaxy had changed, and everyone knew it, and the architect of that change stood in his quarters on Station Verith preparing for what might be the most important moment of his diplomatic career. Laura Kent adjusted Daniel's collar while reviewing the final briefing on her datapad, her expression a mixture of pride and nervous energy that she could not quite hide. Emperor Sithis arrived 2 hours ago in a standard diplomatic vessel, she reported. Not his throne ship, which is significant because using a smaller vessel suggests he is coming as an equal rather than a superior. Daniel nodded, appreciating the symbolic gesture, even as he remained cautious about the meeting ahead. And the princess? Laura's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Valara. She is with him, as you requested, and by all reports, she has been remarkably quiet since the incident. No public appearances, no statements, nothing. Daniel finished preparing and took one last look at himself in the mirror, seeing a man who had aged noticeably in the past month, but who carried himself with a confidence that had not been there when he first arrived at this station. Let us go see what the Emperor has to say. He decided. The meeting took place in a neutral conference room in the station's diplomatic wing, far from both the human quarters and the Imperial section. And Daniel entered to find Emperor Sithis already seated at a long table, with Princess Valara standing behind him like a shadow. The Hand Emperor rose as Daniel approached, a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable before the events of last month. And he extended one hand in the human style of greeting that he had clearly researched before this meeting. Ambassador Cole, the Emperor said as they shook hands. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Daniel took his seat across from the Emperor, with Lavra positioning herself behind him in a mirror of Valara's position. And for a moment, the 4 of them simply looked at each other across the table. Your Majesty, Daniel began, I received your message requesting this meeting, and I am curious to hear what you have to say. Emperor Sithis folded his hands on the table and spoke with visible effort, each word costing him something that Daniel suspected was his pride. What happened in the council chamber was inexcusable, the Emperor admitted. My daughter spoke without wisdom and without the authority of the Empire behind her words, and her actions have damaged relations between our peoples in ways that will take years to repair. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. I have come to offer a formal apology on behalf of the Zirathi Empire, Emperor Sithis continued, and to propose not just the restoration of normal diplomatic relations, but an enhanced partnership that recognizes humanity's unique contributions to galactic civilization. He produced a data crystal and slid it across the table toward Daniel. This contains the terms we are prepared to offer, including full access to Zirathi technology archives, mutual defense provisions, and trade agreements that would benefit Earth significantly. Daniel picked up the crystal and examined it without accessing its contents. Then he set it back on the table and looked directly at the Emperor. Your Majesty, I appreciate your willingness to come here and speak these words, Daniel said carefully, but I must be honest with you. A private apology is not sufficient to address what happened. Emperor Sithis stiffened slightly, and behind him Valara's silver skin seemed to pale even further. What would you consider sufficient? The Emperor asked. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. Your daughter humiliated humanity in front of the entire council, in front of representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy. And that public wound requires a public remedy. He looked past the Emperor to where Valara stood, trying to disappear into the background. If there is to be an apology, it must come from the person who caused the offense, and it must be delivered in the same place where the offense occurred. Before the same audience, Emperor Sithis was silent for a long moment, and Daniel could see the conflict playing out across his alien features as he weighed the cost of what was being asked against the cost of refusing. Finally, the Emperor turned to look at his daughter, and something passed between them that Daniel could not quite interpret. Some communication born of their shared history and the bond between parent and child. Velora stepped forward, her four eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time since she had mocked him at the podium. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "I will do it," she said. "I will apologize before the council, if that is what is required to repair the damage I have caused." 3 days later, the council chamber was filled to capacity for the first time since the opening ceremonies, with delegates from every member species crowding into the tiered seating to witness what promised to be an historic moment. Daniel sat in the human section, which had been moved to a position of honor near the front of the chamber at Chancellor Morven's personal order. And Lara Kent sat beside him with an expression of barely contained anticipation. Princess Valara walked to the central podium alone, without her father or any attendants. And she stood at the same microphone where she had delivered her cool mockery 1 month before. The chamber fell silent as she began to speak. Representatives of the council. Valara's voice carried clearly through the room, though it lacked the arrogance that had marked her previous address. "I stand before you to acknowledge a grave error in judgment." She paused, and Daniel saw her hands tremble slightly before she clasped them together and continued. 1 month ago, in this very chamber, I spoke words of disrespect and cruelty directed at the human delegation and at Ambassador Daniel Cole personally. I mocked their species, their history, their accomplishments, and their right to participate in galactic affairs. Valara took a breath that seemed to require all her strength. I was wrong. My words were born of arrogance and ignorance, and they brought shame not only upon myself, but upon the Zirathi Empire and upon this council, which has always stood for the principle that all civilized species deserve respect, regardless of their age or origin. She turned to face the human section directly, and her four eyes found Daniel's with an expression that held genuine remorse. "Ambassador Cole, on behalf of myself and the Zirathi Empire, I offer my sincere apology for the offense I gave you and your people. I ask that you accept this apology and allow humanity to take its rightful place among the great civilizations of the galaxy." The chamber held its breath as everyone waited to see how Daniel would respond. He rose slowly from his seat and walked toward the podium, not with the hurried steps of someone eager to claim victory, but with the measured pace of someone who understood the weight of the moment. Daniel stopped a few feet from Valara and studied her face for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant princess who had humiliated him, but a young person who had made a terrible mistake and was now trying to make it right. "Princess Valara," Daniel said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber, "I accept your apology." He extended his hand toward her in the human gesture of friendship, and Valara hesitated for just a moment before taking it in her own. "True strength is not found in the age of our civilizations or the size of our fleets," Daniel continued, speaking now to the entire council. "It is found in our ability to admit our mistakes, to learn from them, and to treat others with the dignity that all intelligent beings deserve." He released Valara's hand and turned to address the assembled delegates. "Humanity is young. This is true, and we have much to learn from the older species of this galaxy. But we also have much to teach, including the lesson that walking away from an insult can be more powerful than answering it with anger, and that the greatest victories are those that turn enemies into friends." Lara Kent watched from the human section as Daniel returned to his seat, and she felt tears forming in her eyes that she refused to let fall. The chamber erupted into applause, a sound that built and built until it shook the walls. And for the first time in galactic history, the youngest member species of the council received a standing ovation from the oldest. Chancellor Morven called for order and announced that negotiations would resume with humanity's petition. moved to the top of the agenda, and Daniel allowed himself a small smile as he settled back into his seat. Laura leaned toward him and whispered that he had made history today. Daniel shook his head slowly and replied that he had simply reminded the galaxy of something it had forgotten. That respect is not something you can demand or take or inherit from your ancestors. It is something you earn through your actions and prove through your character. As the council session continued with humanity finally taking its place as an equal among the stars, Daniel looked up at the spinning galaxy displayed on the domed ceiling and felt hope for the future his species would build. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. And sometimes what matters most is knowing when to come back.